Talking about, I suppose, sort of colonial legacies and architecture and those two empires, it was such a sort of labyrinthine subject that I really felt I had to kind of narrow it down as much as possible into sort of one particular um, category of building in order to kind of keep it even remotely coherent. Um, but so I kind of thought that the best way to do that was via, I suppose, maybe counterintuitively, the things that are most obvious. So very, very tall, very, very symbolic buildings in those two empires, and to sort of try and sort of tease out some of the ways in which they do and don't connect, and the ways in which they have and haven't been sort of reproduced or emulated in the present day. So I'm going to share my screen and show a few of these for 15 minutes or so. Okay, hold on. So I wanted to begin with the 19th century and begin, I suppose, with some particularly sort of, again, sort of rather sort of blindingly obvious examples of sort of representative colonial architecture in the British context. So this is St. Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne, in Australia, Catholic cathedral, and it's sort of notable, like as a representative of this, the sort of particular way in which English, or sort of British rather, particularly given that the congregation here would have been mainly Irish, settler colonialism was based on trying to kind of replicate the original built environment as much as possible, sort of not really kind of almost sort of ostentatious refusal to engage with anything that was already there and to sort of reproduce, in this case, I think a sort of English Midland Gothic in an area which, as you can see from the vegetation around it, is very, very distant from the English Midlands. And a lot of these churches, the question of importation is almost total. The architect of St. Patrick's Cathedral was from Cornwall. The architect of this, the Anglican Cathedral, St. Paul's Cathedral in Melbourne, again in Australia, is William Butterfield, who at no point visited Australia. I don't think he ever actually left the UK. And his building had to be kind of gradually sort of changed and rotated because of the fact that he had sort of designed it thinking it was for a completely different site, and no one really wanted to tell him because it was notoriously unpleasant. But the architecture, the materials are frequently imported, the bricks were frequently imported, the labourers were recent settlers, the architects, in the case of St. Patrick's, were recent settlers, or in the case of St. Paul's Cathedral here, weren't even settlers at all and just sort of designing from their offices in Oxford or London. And these are sort of overlaid on an existing context, architectural, cultural landscapes, which there is a sort of aggressive approach of nothing in this could possibly affect us, be worth us incorporating. This is not necessarily the case in all sort of British imperial contexts, particularly in India. There's a quite sort of complicated and often rather lurid attempt to engage with local architecture in that particular part of the empire. But in the settler zone, there was none whatsoever. And that's the case whether or not you're in somewhere very, very temperate, like Melbourne and the colony of Victoria, or if you're in somewhere extremely intemperate, such as Ontario in Canada. The Parliament buildings that were built in the new capital of Ottawa in the late 19th century, these are all actually date from the 1870s, apart from the tower, which is early 20th century, were designed to sort of bring together the various kind of otherwise quite tense settler groups. So the architecture was inspired by Scotland and was inspired by France due to these being two of the major groups of colonizers in Canada. And these were then, the kind of the watchwords for the Parliament building that was then built. The fact that it was Gothic specifically rather than classical had a great deal to do with the United States as a kind of classical model to the south. But again, within all of this, the fact of where it actually is deeply irrelevant. And to, in some ways, kind of sort of bring that in could cause a great deal of opposition at the time. So this is the clock tower at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, which was designed in the early 20th century by an American architect who had worked with Frank Lloyd Wright. And by that point, US architecture had developed a more engaged and one could say more sentimental attitude towards its actual geographical and historical context. Perhaps something that they were more comfortable about doing because most of the genocide had already been completed. So it was much more kind of possible to sort of engage with a culture that was no longer considered a threat. But this approach in New Zealand caused massive opposition. So the clock tower here, the decoration, the motifs were inspired in large part by Maori art. Not that there was any actual engagement in the process by Maori in Auckland, who were quite a large population both then and now. But the very fact of that kind of being brought in meant that it was sort of very, very heavily criticized in the local press and was sort of hated for many decades until gradually being assimilated into the city's iconography. So I suppose those are sort of very, very familiar examples of the way that those iconographic buildings have been used in British imperial contexts. And the degrees in which they do and don't kind of link up with Russian, I'll come to in a second. But before I do, I want to talk about a couple of recent examples of recent engagements in the British colonial context. The first of these is a recent building in Melbourne called the Portrait Tower. And I think here we're dealing with, it would be very, very unusual in Melbourne or Australia in general for anyone to design in a 19th century imperial style. That in much the same way as it would be in the places that the settlers originally came from. You don't have a great many neo-Gothic churches in Manchester or Nottingham, and you don't have them in Melbourne or Sydney. But there is a attempt to, I suppose, engage with that past in a critical way, which I think can be sophisticated and can be deeply superficial. And this, I think, fits into the latter category. So the Portrait Tower represents, as I think is sort of easy-ish to see, hopefully, the balconies have been shaped so that they constitute a portrait of William Barak, who was an Aboriginal activist and artist based in and around Melbourne, who made various attempts to kind of organize local Aboriginal community that was being at that point very rapidly dispossessed and eliminated. He mainly kind of failed in his efforts and died of disease and poverty. A statue of him was briefly advocated in the early 20th century and was refused. And this is sort of seen as some sort of attempt at recompense, the fact that there's a sort of giant face of William Barak that kind of looms over a large part of the central business district. But in terms of what it actually is, of course, it's a block of luxury flats, like the thousands of other blocks of luxury flats in booming capitalist cities like Melbourne. The actual Aboriginal community of Melbourne, which does exist, is mainly concentrated in nearby public housing towers, which have been very beleaguered because very little public housing has been built in the last 30, 40 years in the city. So the sense in which that actual Indigenous community benefits from the building is very, very, very hard to prove. I also want to talk a bit about the sort of and examples in the British context of possible depoliticization of those imperial legacies. One of the kind of one example of this, I guess, sort of, or the reapportioning of its politicization maybe, is at the Bund in Shanghai, which is the heart of the international settlement, the largely British settler, not sorry, but the largely British colonial zone within the city, which was governed by a mainly British municipal council. Right up until the end of the 1930s, there were more Scottish people than there were Chinese on the council. It, ran on a fairly sort of Jim Crow basis, and built this kind of grandiose parade of civic and commercial buildings facing the river in the heart of Shanghai, very much on the model of the Liverpool Pierhead, which was being built around the same time. And those buildings, in their sort of restoration since the 1980s, have largely been sort of reimagined as centers of Chinese power. They tend to have the Chinese flag flying from them. They look over the new high-tech skyline on the Pudong side of the river. They play the East is Red on the hour and a little jingle from the top of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which was, of course, founded as part of the Opium Wars. And arguably, you could now see it as a center of a more sort of expansionist and imperial Chinese polity, if you're that way inclined. But the sense of it sort of, rubbing British imperial power in people's faces, I think, is significantly lessened. So moving from there to the Russian imperial context, I'm not going to make any grand claims about Russian imperialism in the course of this. I don't have enough time. I think it's a large subject. But if you look at 19th century Russian imperialism, it's very, very, very straightforwardly a species of the same sort of thing that was being done by Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, the USA. It's not some sort of special case. I think it is arguably a special case in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, it's more or less the same stuff that's happening everywhere. And it is also frequently a settler architecture, particularly in Central Asia. There are what is now the Republic of Kazakhstan in particular had significant settlement in the 19th century of overwhelmingly Russian towns being built, and kind of solely Russian towns being built that excluded Central Asians. Similar things kind of happened in what's now in Uzbekistan and Tashkent and Samarkand. And it happened here in Almaty. So this is the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in the center of Almaty. And, it's sort of 17th century Naryshkin style Baroque, largely prefabricated, mostly wooden, due partly to the fact that it's in an earthquake zone. But it had a fairly similar function to the contemporary cathedrals that were being built in Melbourne at the same time. It's a statement of settler power, a statement of symbolic kind of dominance of that population, and an attempt to kind of make the new zone that's being settled look as much like the places where the settlers had come from as possible. The Soviet case, although I as I said, I think it's in some ways a special case, I think there is a period in which it's not a special case at all, and it actually fairly obviously continues that 19th century imperialism. And that period, I think, is roughly from the 1930s until the late 1950s. And that would include the sort of so-called high Stalinist architecture of Moscow. So in here you can see in the distance Moscow State University, one of 7 skyscrapers built in a kind of neo-Russian imperialist style across the capital of the Soviet Union. And you can see from the church in front of it in the foreground how much it's obviously modeled on 19th century Russian Orthodox architecture. You can also see that here in the Hotel Leningradskaya, again in Moscow. In the foreground, you have the Kazan railway station, which is a early 20th century revivalist, kind of neo-Russian, neo-Orthodox railway station, comparable to the kind of imperial Gothic of something like St Pancras in London. And you can see how decades later, in the late 1940s and early 50s, the Hotel Leningradskaya has kind of followed a very, very similar style, despite the apparent gap in politics. These skyscrapers, these sort of 7 in Moscow, were exported around the USSR and its satellite states at the end of the 40s and the start of the 50s. One of the more diminutive examples was placed at what was conceived really as the sort of entrance to the Soviet Union in Brest in Belarus. And Brest had previously been, less than 10 years before this, it had been a part of the Polish Second Republic. Its population was overwhelmingly Polish and Jewish. That population had been either exterminated or deported to Poland. This kind of miniature copy of Moscow State University was built over the main railway station to kind of announce that you were, leaving Poland and leaving kind of the rest of Europe and entering the USSR. A gesture which is, its sort of imperial nature is fairly obvious. I also want to talk a bit about the way that this kind of works in the Baltic states. And here you can see the Orthodox Cathedral in Riga in the foreground and the Stalin-era Academy of Sciences in the background, and the 80s TV tower behind that, which I think is a different fairy tale. But here you have, again, 2 really, really straightforward examples of kind of colonial export architecture. An Orthodox cathedral like any other Orthodox cathedral, and a Stalinist kind of ornamented imperial high-rise, much like those within the USSR, and particularly within Moscow. Both of these kind of 2 imperial monuments are separated by, about 70 years, but their similarity, I think, should be fairly obvious. This also happens within the satellite states, the countries which, by hook and by crook, are kind of become part of the Soviet sphere of influence at the end of the Second World War. The last country to fall into that sphere of influence in 1948 is Czechoslovakia, as then was. And it has relatively few Stalinist buildings, due mainly to the fact that it wasn't as bombed as everywhere else, but also partly due to the deep hostility to that architecture on the part of most Czech architects, including those who were communists. But one exception to this is the Hotel International, which is placed on a hill in the suburbs of Prague, and is another kind of miniaturized version of Moscow State University, which is kind of has no discernible relationship to any of the kind of local traditional or modernist building traditions, but which is placed in the middle of this as a fairly obvious bit of imperial power. But in a similar way to the Bund in Shanghai, I don't want to be deterministic about the way in which these projects do and don't endure. I don't necessarily suggest that they could cast as permanent shadow. And one way in which one building project which I think doesn't is the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw, which is kind of counterintuitive because it is originally one of the most colonial of all of these buildings, designed by a Russian architect, built by Russian laborers who were housed in Warsaw for the duration of the building's construction, and kind of conceived as a gift in the kind of Godfather style offer you can't refuse way from the Soviet Union to Poland. And this building, despite that, I think is now, fair to say, one of the most popular within Warsaw. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. One of which is the fact that it is, unlike most of the others, it's a public building. It's not an Orthodox cathedral, it's not a university building, and it's not, unlike many of these buildings, a luxury hotel or a block of luxury flats. It's a public building that's used by most people in Warsaw who will have used it at one point or another. Um, I think the other reason for that kind of assimilation of the building, the fact that it's now, a very, very popular one in Poland, particularly of younger Poles, is also to do with the fact that although you wouldn't always know it with some Polish politicians, Russian colonialism is something that is very firmly in the past in Poland. The idea that it is still under threat from Russian imperialism is quite a hard one to swallow, which is obviously not the case of the Baltic states or Belarus or Kazakhstan, all of which countries very much subject to it in the present day, either as a threat or as a reality in the Belarusian case. And obviously this applies even more obviously to Ukraine, which I'm not going to talk about because I think there's an enormous amount to say which can't be fit into this. And also Lesia will later kind of draw a lot of that out. The revival of these buildings is kind of one of the things that I want to kind of finish off on. The kind of the sort of very, very nakedly imperialist architecture of the Stalin era from the 30s to the 50s was mostly, in some ways, even taboo in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and particularly in the satellite countries and in the peripheral republics, but also within Russia itself. And its revival actually comes after 1991 in Russia. Initially, as sort of first time as tragedy, second time as kitsch way, in the form of a luxury skyscraper in the suburbs of Moscow called the Triumph Palace, which kind of emulated the 7 Stalin skyscrapers in a rather cheaper way as kind of new luxury flats for the new capitalist oligarchy. What is perhaps more surprising is the fact that there is also a copy of it in Astana in Kazakhstan. And as mentioned, I think Kazakhstan is a country which does have to grapple with the Russian imperial legacy in the present day in a very, very acute way, partly due to the legacy of settlement, which was very significant in Kazakhstan. I don't think ever quite a majority, but always from the 19th century on, a very, very large part of the population of Kazakhstan have been Russian and other Slavic settlers. But also in terms of the kind of political geography of Kazakhstan, insofar as Almaty ceased to be the capital in the late 1990s, and it was moved to what had been the Russian and then Soviet settler city of Tselinograd, which was renamed Astana as the Kazakh capital. And one of the reasons for putting a new capital there in that kind of very, very densely kind of Russian settler zone was as a way of sort of asserting the Kazakhna of that area and of sort of moving a Kazakh population to it. So in some ways it was, despite the fact that the obvious kind of connections between the Russian and Kazakh ruling class at that point, an attempt at sort of de-Russifying the area. But nonetheless, one of its kind of larger and most symbolic buildings is this copy of the architecture of the Stalin era, the Triumph Astana, as it's called. And whether or not that can be seen as something like in the kind of Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw or the Bund in Shanghai as something where, it's been sort of depoliticized and the coloniality of it has been gradually kind of watered down, I think it's much more difficult to say, partly because of how recent it is, but partly because of the way that it sort of speaks of the particular values of the sort of new capitalist ruling class, that rather paradoxically, perhaps, the iconography of Stalinism has been enormously popular with the new capitalist class in both Russia and in Kazakhstan. And I think one of the places in which that's really, again, becomes quite obvious and starts to stare you in the face what that kind of continuity can mean is in some of the new building projects in Moscow itself. So this is the Armory Business Center in the center of Moscow, a picture taken about 7 years ago. It's now completed. And this is a very, very kind of clear attempt to sort of evoke the architecture of the Stalin era, again, via a kind of more modernist, guess less kitsch idiom, but again, it's kind of quite clear what it's doing and what it's trying to evoke. But in this particular case, seeing it as something that's purely about aesthetics and as some sort of postmodernist game with architectural form is very, very difficult to do. That this kind of re-Stalinization of a lot of Moscow's architecture and of a lot of its aesthetics came alongside, a kind of increasing clearing of urban space, creating, again, these very, very large imperial and militaristic boulevards. And also happened at a time in which there was an enormous amount of military parades. That the the kind of the Victory Day parades and other kind of anniversaries that would happen in Moscow became celebrated of ever more sort of melodrama, with kind of tanks and missiles and so forth being carried down the city streets. And looking at this now, 7 years later, it seems impossible to see this as anything other than a country that was absolutely spoiling for a war, as a country which, where this wasn't a kind of, just a kind of depoliticized evocation of imperial aesthetics, but was actually a country which was undergoing imperial nostalgia to the point of trying to reconstitute part of its empire, which brings us to where we are now. So I hope some of these connections have some sort of logic to them. And I'll stop there. Thanks.